Kenneth Allen McDuff was a notorious American serial killer who spent his life mired in sociopathy and violence. His methods of murder were extremely brutal, with shooting and strangulation being his usual methods. However, torturing his victims was the only way to satisfy his perverted desires. He is also known as the Broomstick Killer, due to the fact that in his first serial murder, he strangled a female victim with a broomstick. On March 21, 1946, in a hospital in the small town of Rosebud, Texas, a couple welcomed their fifth child, whom they named Kenneth. The town of Rosebud is sparsely populated, with just over 1,000 permanent residents. Kenneth's family is undoubtedly one of the more affluent in the area, with his father working in the construction industry as a concrete processor, and the building boom in Texas in the 1960s made his father's business extremely profitable. His mother, on the other hand, ran a self-service laundromat in the town, which also did very well. Kenneth grew up with a lot of attention and pampering from his family, where he didn't have to take on any responsibilities or follow any code of conduct. But the strangest of all is his mother and three sisters, who treat Kenneth as if he was a god, doting on him and indulging him without any boundaries. Kenneth's mom is quite the aggressive person. She's tall and known in the town for her tough, domineering temper. With such a mother, Kenneth often took pleasure in bullying his classmates and intimidating his teachers at school because he believed that no matter what wrong he committed, his mom would step in and help him out. Once, when Kenneth was punished at school, his mother rushed to the school with a pistol in her hand to defend him, so she became known as the gun-toting mom. The cause of his violent behavior is not only his mother's overindulgence, but also the influence of his older brother, Lonnie, who is the real troublemaker in the family. With his violent temper and bad behavior, and once he even took out a knife to threaten the principal, so that in his daily contact, Kenneth follows his example and gradually becomes violent. Kenneth's sixth-grade teacher mentioned something strange in an interview. At the time, she called Kenneth into the office to ask why he was always getting into trouble. Kenneth just sat quietly on his stool without saying a word, and no matter what the teacher asked him, he didn't respond at all. He just sat there looking down, avoiding eye contact with the teacher, which she thought was strange because it was extremely unusual for a young boy. In the school's IQ test, Kenneth scored a 92. In fact, he wasn't the smartest student in the class, but he was passionate about catching the attention of others. For example, when the test results came out, if he got the lowest score in the class, he'd make sure everyone knew about it. He'd even make bad jokes just to show that he didn't care about his grades. In 8th grade, Kenneth's arrogance, which had been encouraged by his family, was completely crushed. At the time, he had a very bad reputation at school and was largely disliked. So he decided to challenge Tommy, who was one of the most popular boys in the school. Kenneth felt that if he could beat Tommy, it would gain him a lot of respect. He wanted people's attention and recognition. Tommy was a jock and had a very humble personality. That day, Kenneth purposely bumped into him in the hallway and kept insulting him and calling him a hypocrite. Tommy was so aggravated that he couldn't stand it anymore and agreed to Kenneth's challenge. They arranged to fight by the drainage ditch after school. Word spread quickly throughout the school that the school's most popular and least popular students were going to fight. So as soon as the bell rang, a large group of people gathered around to watch. But the fight only lasted a few minutes because, although Kenneth was big, he wasn't strong and hadn't been trained to do anything more than bite. But Tommy worked out every day and was so strong that he easily knocked Kenneth into the drain. From that day on, Kenneth was quiet. He never bothered his classmates or got into any annoying pranks. After a few months, he couldn't stand the strange looks from the people around him. He dropped out of school and then went to work for his father doing some manual labor. Perhaps because Kenneth worked for his father for several years, he became bolder and bolder, which led him to dare to commit serious crimes at the age of 18. It was one night in 1964 when Kenneth was drunk and feeling sexual urges. He sneaked into a house and raped a woman. To make sure she didn't call the police, he took a knife and slit her throat, then dumped her in a drainage ditch. When he got home, he told Lonnie what had happened. Lonnie was totally cool about it and told him to go to bed and forget about it. And the victim didn't die after being dumped in the gutter. She was rushed to the hospital for resuscitation in a very short time. Some people say that after Kenneth raped her, she got pregnant and gave birth to the baby. A few weeks later, Kenneth was arrested for burglary, but not the rape of a woman and attempted murder. He was charged with 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary and sentenced to 12 four-year prison terms, or a total of 48 years. However, After serving just under a year of his sentence, his application for parole was approved. At this point, Kenneth's heart goes through some subtle changes as he believes he has become more emboldened and doesn't give a damn about the law because he not only committed a dozen burglaries, but even raped and murdered a woman, but was paroled after only a year in prison. So he started getting involved in some of the crazy schemes he came up with, targeting some of the thinner and more timid people. One of them was Roydale Green, an employee of Kenneth's father who lived with his mother. Once, Kenneth showed some of his cruel pranks in Green's mother's bedroom, including nailing a girl to the floor and inserting a syringe filled with hot water into her body. Green was 2 years younger than Kenneth and lacked much life experience, so he was easily mesmerized by Kenneth's stories of sadistic sex. Kenneth also bragged that he had raped and strangled a couple of women. He told him that killing a woman was as easy as killing a chicken, which he wasn't too convinced of until a few months later when an incident occurred. On August 6, 1966, Kenneth and Green were working at a construction site in Temple. They were pouring concrete that morning. When they finished the job, they cleaned up the site, and then Kenneth drove Green to Fort Worth in the new Dodge Charger his mother had given him when he got out of prison. Green has never been to Fort Worth, but since Kenneth worked there a couple of years before and said he knew some girls there, he's going to show Green the ropes. So the two of them are driving around Everman just south of Fort Worth, drinking beer and visiting friends, including a girl Kenneth met at church. That night, after dropping the girl off at home, Kenneth saw the girl he was looking for. She was pretty, wearing a red and white striped shirt and cut-off jeans and driving a 1955 Ford. She was standing near the baseball field talking to two boys. The three were Edna Sullivan, 16 years old, Robert Brand, 17 years old, who is Sullivan's boyfriend, and Mark Dunham, 15 years old, Robert's cousin, who was visiting relatives from California. At that time, Kenneth had a .38 caliber handgun in his hand and stepped out of the car to approach the three young teenagers, while Green sat quietly in the car looking them. Kenneth first demanded that the three young teenagers hand over their wallets and then proceeded to, he forced them, with the gun in his hand, to get into the trunk of the car and lock them in it. Kenneth then explained to Green, saying, "I was just going to rob them, but they all had a good look at my face, so I just had to kill them." Kenneth drove Sullivan's Ford slowly down the dark country roads while Green followed in Kenneth's Dodge. Green was still wondering if Kenneth really intended to hurt the hostages. About half an hour later, Kenneth took a side road into a field where he stopped the car and opened the trunk. He then said, "I want this young lady to come out," and grabbed Sullivan by the arm, pulling her out forcefully. Kenneth ordered Green to lock her in the trunk of the Dodge, and the two boys stayed in the trunk of the Ford, begging Kenneth to spare their lives. But Kenneth responded only with his actions. He raised his pistol to the boys' heads and pulled the trigger. Brand was shot twice in the head and died at the scene. His cousin Mark was shot 3 times and didn't die until Kenneth fired again. Green saw the gunfire and covered his ears and eyes. When he looked back, he saw Kenneth's expression, which seemed calm and content. It seemed to say, "What do you think so far, Green?" And then Kenneth parked the Ford next to the fence on the side road and left the scene with Green in the Dodge with a terrified Sullivan in the trunk. They drove away from the Johnson County line, heading south, and then stopped on a dirt road about 11 miles from where they had left the Ford and the two boys. Kenneth first opened the trunk and released Sullivan, who he ordered to remove her clothes. He then threw her into the back seat and raped her, violating her twice before he forced Green to do the same. Throughout this entire process, Green remembers only one thing Sullivan said: "I think you ripped something." Once Kenneth had let off some steam, he drove down a gravel road again. 10 minutes later, he pulled up at a side road and got out of the car to drag Sullivan to the front. He sat her down on the ground. Green wasn't sure what Kenneth was planning to do next, but he quickly saw Kenneth force Sullivan's head to the ground and then strangle her with a broom handle. Kenneth was holding her so tightly that his arms were bulging with veins, while Sullivan was flailing her arms and kicking her legs in an attempt to break free. Green was told to grab her legs, and when he did, Kenneth ended her life for good. They then dumped Sullivan's body in the bush next to the trail and drove home, stopping again on the way to bury the purses belonging to the two boys and then discarding their own blood-stained clothes as well. The next afternoon, while Green was driving around with a friend, the news about the murders came on the car's radio. He was so shaken up by the news that he immediately knew he had to tell someone what he knew. At the time, the murder was called the Broomstick murders, which is where Kenneth got his nickname. Green eventually told the police what happened, even though he was involved in the murder, but he only got 25 years in prison because he became a key witness for the prosecution. Kenneth, on the other hand, was sentenced to death, but he was not executed because, in 1972, something happened that shocked the entire United States, and that was Furman v. Georgia case. To put it simply, one man was sentenced to death for murder and 2 others for sexual assault. They complained that the sentences were inconsistent with the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. At the time, the U.S. Supreme Court was unanimous in its opinion that the death penalty was unconstitutional in these cases. This led to a nationwide moratorium on executions, with 629 death row inmates having their death sentences commuted to life imprisonment. Kenneth was one of them. He then often applied for parole and also tried to bribe a parole member in 1981, but he was caught and sentenced to 2 years in prison for the bribe. Around 1986, overcrowding in prisons became an issue in Texas, so the governor of the state pressured. He asked the parole board to release 750 inmates a week. In 1989, 2 of the 3 parole board members decided that since Kenneth had started taking college classes, he was someone who could still contribute to society. They decided to grant Kenneth parole. When Kenneth was released from prison on October 11th, several young women in Central Texas went missing. They were found dead in almost the same manner, and it was suspected that Kenneth was responsible for their deaths. The first victim was Sarafia Minetta Parker, a 29-year-old sex worker. She was found in a remote field in Temple, Texas, on October 14th, which was the 3rd day after Kenneth's release from prison. Her autopsy report showed that she had many traces of being beaten and strangled. As the time approached, Kenneth was suspected of being the murderer. Denise Janine Mason was a 20-year-old sex worker whose body was found in Austin. Her autopsy report also showed signs of beatings and strangulation marks on her body, and Kenneth was considered a suspect in this case, but there was no definitive evidence to confirm that he was the killer. In July, Kenneth was sent back to prison for violating his parole, because he had been yelling racial slurs at a group of black teenagers and then chasing and threatening one of them with a knife. His mother paid more than $2,000 to pay off an attorney. So, on December 18th, he was released from prison again. On October 10th, 1991, 36-year-old Brenda Thompson disappeared in Waco. Later that night, Kenneth was pulled over by a police officer on the highway. While he was being questioned by the officer, another officer heard some strange noises near the car. Then he saw through the window that there was a woman inside the car who was kicking the windshield over and over again. Her hands and feet were bound. Her mouth was gagged, and when the officer was just about to get his gun to warn him, Kenneth started the vehicle straight through the roadblock, and the 3 officers gave chase. But Kenneth was smart enough to turn off his headlights and escape the police. Eventually, Kenneth parked his car in a nearby wooded area and tortured Thompson to death. Just 5 days later, 17-year-old Regina Deanne Moore also went missing. She was last seen getting into Kenneth's car at a motel. She screamed and kicked at the glass repeatedly in the car. Eventually, she was raped and strangled. On December 29, 1991, Colleen Ann Reed, a 28-year-old certified public accountant, was abducted by Kenneth from an Austin car wash. 3 witnesses heard her screaming and saw Kenneth's car speeding away from the car wash, and they also found Colleen's car abandoned at the car wash. On the night of February 24, 1992, Valencia K. Joshua, a 22-year-old sex worker from Fort Worth, who went to the same college as Kenneth, Texas Tech, went missing. She was last seen knocking on Kenneth's dormitory window. On March 25th, her body was found in a shallow grave on a golf course near the university, and the cause of death was strangulation. On February 29, 1992, 22-year-old Melissa Ann Northup mysteriously disappeared while working at the Quick Pack store in Waco, when she was not only pregnant, but also a mother of 2. Melissa had originally expressed concerns about the store's security measures, and the day of her disappearance coincided with her last shift at work. Later that evening, her husband rushed to the store after several failed attempts to reach her by phone, only to find the store empty, $250 missing from the cash register, and Melissa's 1977 Buick Regal missing. Since Kenneth used to work at the store, when the police learned that Melissa had disappeared that night near the store, they named Kenneth as their primary suspect straight away. By this time, Kenneth had moved to Missouri, where he paid for a new car and a fake ID, and became a garbage collector under the name Richard Fowler. The police first questioned several of Kenneth's friends, including 34-year-old Alva Hank Worley. After several interviews, on April 20th, 1992, Worley admitted that he and Kenneth had worked together to kidnap Colleen. It turned out that Colleen's death was an accident. Worley and Kenneth had originally planned to go buy drugs, but while passing through a car wash, Kenneth spotted Colleen. So they managed to kidnap her and drove north to Belton, Texas, where Kenneth and Worley took turns assaulting her and knocking her unconscious before murdering her on a dirt road. Melissa's body was found floating in a gravel pit in Dallas County on April 26th. She had been strangled, and her hands were still tied tightly when she was found. Once the police found Melissa's body, they quickly set up a search party and let the public know that Kenneth was wanted for a string of murders in Texas over the past few years. On May 3, 1992, Kenneth's co-worker looked at the photos on America's Most Wanted. The more he looked at them, the more he thought Kenneth looked like his co-worker Richard Fowler, who was on the wanted list, so he decided to report this to the police. After the police got the tip, they first looked into Richard Fowler's background. They found out that he'd been arrested before for looking for a sex worker and that his fingerprints had been collected. So the police compared his fingerprints with those of Kenneth, and it turned out that they were the same person. Kenneth was arrested on May 4th while driving to a landfill in Kansas City, Kansas. One reporter had written in 1992 that this time, God willing, the system would do the right thing, and if the death penalty needed a good reason, it was Kenneth. In February 1993, he was tried for Melissa's murder. The prosecutors highlighted the similarities between Melissa's and Colleen's cases, even getting Worley to testify that he was involved in Colleen's kidnapping to incriminate Kenneth. Kenneth was ultimately convicted of Melissa's murder and sentenced to death. In April, Kenneth was accused of kidnapping, raping, and murdering Colleen. Even though her body hadn't been found, an eyewitness said he was one of the kidnappers, and he also said Kenneth's car matched the one seen. The hairs found in the car matched Colleen's. So on February 23, 1994, Kenneth was convicted on all charges. On March 1st, he was sentenced to death again. But for some reason, prosecutors didn't charge him with Valencia's murder. A few days later, Kenneth was taken out of the death row. The police asked him to help find the victim's body. He led the police to find Colleen's body, but however, Kenneth chose to abandon the search for the remains of Thompson and Regina because he wanted to delay his execution, but the plan did not succeed. In the end, on September 29, 1998, Regina's body was found in McLennan County, and then Thompson's body was also found in McLennan County on October 3rd. On November 17, 1998, Kenneth received a lethal injection that ended his life. His last words before he died were, "I'm ready to be released. Let go of me." At the end of the story, Kenneth's family, who doted on Kenneth, did not claim Kenneth's body, and then prison officials buried him in Captain Joe Bird Cemetery, where his headstone bears only the date of his execution and the number of his death row cell.